the 100,000 Afghans like the Afzalis who are here now. So, Ms. Mackler, I want to thank you in your testimony for raising the Afghan Adjustment Act. I agree with you and the sentiments from others on the panel that we should support the Afghan nationals who put themselves in harm's way by supporting our mission and who are here in the United States now. So if you could, in the minute that I have left, discuss why you believe the Afghan Adjustment Act is important and what it would do.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Briefly, when those 75,000 or so Afghans landed on American soil after the NEO, they had no pathways under immigration law to be admitted into the United States, and so they were here on a temporary permission called parole, which will expire for the most part in August of this year. They have no ways of staying here for the future without the Afghan Adjustment Act. They have no way of setting down roots. They have no way of simply having immigration legal status, and all that confers of maybe even one day becoming U.S. citizens. And so I think first and foremost, to give that permanency and the sense of welcome home that we are hoping to offer these Afghan allies, we have to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. The Afghan Adjustment Act also includes fixes for the SIV system in part. It allows for Afghans beyond those who are evacuated in that first wave to settle here. And as I've mentioned over and over again in this hearing, we don't have we just do not have immigration pathways that are available to Afghans. I get asked every single day for somebody's help for an immigration option, and they do not exist. The Afghan Adjustment Act would at least serve this population to allow them to be here and to live in America safely, freely, and with all that comes with that.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Green.
Thank you, Chairman, for your persistent leadership on this issue, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today. Thank you for your service to our country. Rangers lead the way, Night Stalkers don't quit. Many of you may recall from the movie Lone Survivor, the Night Stalker helicopter that crashed attempting to rescue stranded Navy SEALs. All on board perished, including my friend Stephen Reich and another man I know well from the unit, Master Sergeant Trey Ponder. Trey's parents are my constituents, and I often see them at events in the district. Before I begin my comments, I want to say a word to my fellow Afghanistan veterans. Our service and our sacrifices were not in vain. We kept our nation safe from a terrorist attack for 20 years. No one who served, and like myself, lost friends, should ever feel it was for nothing. We protected America. You protected America for 20 years. When I signed into the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, one of the first guys to greet me was a guy named Corey. Corey was recovering from wounds he had sustained on Roberts Ridge. The Navy SEAL, Neil Roberts, had fallen from one of our aircraft, which was unable to rescue him. And so we live by the code. Leave no man, leave no woman behind. So 2 Chinook helicopters were dispatched with a massive quick reaction force. As they landed to attempt to rescue Roberts, both were shot down. And 40 or so Rangers, SEALs, and Special Operations aviators were stranded on that hilltop, surrounded by 250 Taliban. The intense battle that lasted almost 24 hours, 7 Americans gave their lives because they lived by the oath, leave no man behind. The Ranger Code, which I learned back in the day, has a line or two that is relevant for today. Every Ranger graduate, every member of the Ranger Regiment knows this creed. Those lines, and I quote, "I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy. Under no circumstance will I ever embarrass my country." Senior general officers at the Pentagon have told me they insisted that the evacuation occur from Bagram Air Base. Those leaders, we can debate about whether or not we should have, could have, would have, whether Biden should have stopped, not withdrawn at all, but they decided to withdraw, and senior general officers told me that the evacuation should have occurred from Bagram Air Base. Those leaders told the president, we need 3,500 soldiers to guard the base for the exfil. According to those generals, in a room at the White House, the president himself said, no, go to 600 troops. With 600, you can't hold Bagram, so the decision to exfil from Kabul became necessary. That decision killed 13 American warriors and left hundreds of American citizens behind enemy lines, many of whom fell into the hands of the enemy. And more, that decision made by Joe Biden to leave Americans behind was an embarrassment to this nation. And it most certainly crystallized Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. And I'll debate that with anyone who cares to take me on. Now, in the few minutes that I have, Colonel Mann, do you think that the exfil would have been safer from Bagram Air Base had we surrounded that with 3,500 troops? Thank you.
I do, Congressman.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a sensitive question now. I have an answer that is tragic for myself, but I'm going to ask a question of all of the veterans here. Do you know anyone who soon after this disastrous withdrawal committed suicide because they felt like it was all for nothing? Yes, I see lots of heads nodding.
Yes.
I do too. The blood of those men and women's hands are on the president, period. We live by the oath, leave no man behind. It'd be great if the commander-in-chief did as well. Now I want to say very quickly, reiterate what I said at the beginning. Take this to your friends. Take this to our brothers and sisters. It was not in vain. We kept America safe for 20 years. Those sacrifices saved Americans' lives from a terrorist attack back home. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. God bless you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Jacobs is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I want to thank all of our panelists for your service to our country, both if you served in the military, but also all the work that you did to help get people out of Afghanistan and get them to safety. And Sergeant Vargas Andrews, I know you deployed from Pendleton. I represent the San Diego area, and I want to say a special thank you to you for your service and your sacrifice. You've made our country very proud. We've talked a lot about the criticisms of how the evacuation happened, and I share many of them. In fact, I was one of the original members of the Honoring Our Promises working group that my colleague, Mr. Crow, co-led on a bipartisan basis. And my office worked with many of your groups to help get hundreds of Afghans out of Afghanistan, and we're still working to help get folks through the SIV process. But I think a lot of the criticism that we've heard should actually be leveled at this body, at this committee, because it's our job to oversee the State Department. And over the years, we've systematically underfunded and underappreciated their work to the point where when we had to do this NEO, the State Department didn't have the capacity it needed to do the mission we were asking of it. And I would welcome working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to figure out how we boost State Department funding and capacity and oversight to make sure that the State Department has the capacity it needs in the future, not only for a scenario like this, but because we know that diplomacy helps prevent and minimize conflict, and we could prevent more situations like this. Now, Specialist Gunderson, you said in your testimony that you were born 1 year before September 11th. I'm not quite as young as you, but I am the youngest person on this dais, and I was in middle school when September 11th happened. And we've talked a lot about the failure of oversight and the abdication of responsibilities. And I want to talk about the abdication of responsibility of this body, because Congress did not take a single vote on the war in Afghanistan since you were 1 year old and I was 11 years old. That's 21 years that Congress allowed this war to continue without ever doing our job in oversight to make sure that what we were doing was actually making sense. And our generation has been told over and over our entire lives that we're making gains, that we just needed a little more time, a little more resources, that we were turning a corner. Now, San Diego is one of the largest military communities in the country, and we are a large Afghan community, refugee community as well. So I take this very personally, because we lost more than 2,300 service members and tens of thousands of Afghans over the 20 years, and countless more from the trauma they experienced there, and my colleague, Mr. Green, talked about that so eloquently. Watching our troops leave Afghanistan was a stark reminder of the costs of 2 decades of war, but it was also a stark reminder of how we got there. Of the many, many years where we had military leaders come in front of us and tell us we just need a little more resources, a little more time, we're turning a corner, where they were telling the public that we were winning, when privately our military leaders knew that that was never going to be possible. And Mr. Lucier, you wrote about this so poignantly in an op-ed in the Washington Post in December of 2019. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter his op-ed into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, and I want to read a few sentences from this. I quote, "However, despite knowledge at the top that little progress was being made in Afghanistan, that victory was never likely, and that the entire enterprise seemed to be fatally mismanaged, this isn't the story that the government or the military told the public." And again, instead, time and time again, officials talked about how local forces were getting better, how it was impossible for the Taliban to win this fight, and the infamous soundbite that American forces always seem to be turning a corner in Afghanistan. And my last quote from this: "The inability of top officials to tell the truth made it harder for me to come home from war." Now, Mr. Lucier, following on the ranking member's question, do you think the outcome would have been different if we had stayed 2, 5, 10 more years? And I know we talked about the mental health consequences of this retrograde on service members, and I feel that personally, I do. But can you speak to the mental health implications of fighting an unwinnable war and how you would have felt as a veteran if we kept sending young people to experience those horrifying things while knowing that we couldn't win?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. It's a difficult question. I spoke out in favor of bringing that war to an end because of exactly my experiences. It was difficult to continue to watch the news and in a small byline somewhere, because Afghanistan was not at the time making a lot of headlines, but you would see a KIA notice from somewhere over there and then texting your friends, oh, do we know who it is yet? And is it someone I know? It was an odd way to experience the war that I left in of May of 2012, for it to continue to visit my life on the news as I was trying to move on and go to school. I don't know what the right answer was to ending that war. What I do know is that lack of oversight that you cited, that we didn't have public conversations for the last 20 years, that congressional hearings on foreign policy writ large, but specifically Afghanistan, have statistically declined, and that we didn't have a robust public conversation about the war that I fought and that people were continuing to deploy to for the 10 years after I got home, that had already been going on for 10 years, meant that we weren't as prepared to have a conversation about withdrawal, because there wasn't a robust record, because there hadn't been congressional oversight, public discussion. It was a war that at times felt forgotten, except for folks like myself, Gold Star families, and Afghans who made it here. And it's worth noting how many had come here and how many are now here. 70,000 Afghan troops, military.
Middle-aged time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Davidson.
I thank the chairman. A very heartfelt thanks for having this hearing. Frankly, it's a shame that we had to wait this far after the events in Afghanistan to have a hearing like this. And while this committee is generally very collaborative and bipartisan, I think the delay in it should be noted. And part of the problem has been the lack of accountability for, frankly, senior leaders, whether they're in uniform or out of uniform. People that were deployed on the ground were held accountable for all kinds of things, rules of engagement that often were incompatible with the missions that they were assigned to do, a lack of a clear mission. No one ever really defined what victory was for many years on the ground there, yet we kept sending people over. Each commander would define it a little differently. You don't have to have served in uniform to know that it's a bad plan to get the military out first and then try to get the civilians out. The fact that it turned out the way that it did is probably better than you would think if you took the military out first and then got the civilians out. But I just wonder, Mr. Hong, if you could comment about the challenges you faced as a member of Congress, as the chairman highlighted in his open remarks. I was dealing with people who were sending me copies of American blue passport holding citizens, dozens of them, in areas of the country, Mazar-e Sharif, for example, trying to get out, desperately trying to get out, manifests with hundreds of people on planes, working with the State Department, and finally, the people on the ground there would get a safe third country that give them clearance to leave. And rather than help, our own State Department contacted the safe third country and worked to cancel the clearance so that people stayed on the ground. Now, I still can't figure out a motive for that, but I know that it happened. So I can't imagine the people that were stuck on the ground, the people that risked their own lives to help us accomplish our disjointed mission there over years, and some of whom were lost after they had to disperse and wait and hide and be hunted down because our State Department gave control of our embassy and all of our known allies over to the Taliban, and it basically turned into a hunting list. They hunted them down in their homes, and I just can't imagine that, but I know a lot of you had a hand in this, but Mr. Hong, if you could comment on what it was like and the kind of role that you and others played, because frankly, the idea that we needed civilian dollars to come in and do this is mind-blowing. I mean, this is clearly the mission of the United States of America. Yet we were trying to bridge it from people who felt a bond of loyalty and did. So thank you for doing that. But also just what were you confronting as you were dealing with that?
Congressman, thank you. I appreciate the question. There's been a lot that has happened in the last year and a half that has shaken my faith in our government. There was a yawning gulf between our obligations to our allies and what our government was able to do in August of 2021. However, thousands of our citizens saw that yawning gulf and jumped in and helped. And they did it from their bedrooms, they emptied out their savings accounts, they took on challenges that they shouldn't have been in a position to have to take on. So my faith in America and Americans has never been stronger. It was unreal at times to get requests, and I'm not the only person on this panel that has received these requests from congressional offices, from executive level agencies, from high-ranking officials asking for help evacuating their allies. Me, us, private citizens, receiving requests from our own government to assist what is essentially a governmental function. So it was humbling, it was terrifying, it was at times stupefying.
Well, it's well said. And I just got to say, look, we had a conversation here. Republicans, particularly Republican veterans, came back here to Washington, D.C. to basically plead with the administration to make this an event-based exit, not a time-driven thing, but an event-driven thing. When do we get all of our people out? Well, okay, that's the last day there, and not until then. Instead, the administration stayed on a timeline of 31 August, and inconceivably to me, we had colleagues who wanted to deny that the missions that you guys were part of in the private sector, trying to save people in other parts of the country, were even happening. And but for the records that we preserved and were on State Department computers, I truly believe they would have continued to try to deny and lie and say that they weren't even there. Thankfully, we had the evidence, we had the proof, and your statement, we still have faith in the American people, is well-founded. And may God bless this country, the people who are still trapped in Afghanistan, and may we finally do the right thing. I yield.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank each and every one of the witnesses for joining us today. I want to express my deep gratitude to those of you who served for your selfless service to our country, and to all of you for helping Americans and vulnerable Afghans to get to safety. As we all know, the war in Afghanistan lasted for over 20 years, over 4 administrations, and over 10 Congresses. And the American people fought and paid for this war in so many ways. They deserve a full accounting, as many mistakes were made along the way by many, many decision makers over many years. So I'd like to start with the February 2020 Trump-Doha agreement. Mr. Lucier, when I read that agreement, I was shocked by how few conditions there were in that agreement. There were no protections for the women and girls in Afghanistan, for the Afghan people who had helped us and worked side by side with our forces. Frankly, there were hardly any requirements for the Taliban to meet. So in retrospect, what should have been done differently in negotiating or reaching that agreement?
Thank you for the question. like you pointed out too, I think robust safeguards and for vulnerable populations would have been helpful and prevented some of the situations that we see today. But again, just to pivot back, that I think some of my feelings about the war, how it was conducted, and how it ended are reflected in that op-ed and something that I've spoken about. But I just want to pivot back again to the Team America has these 70,000 folks who are here, and these questions about how the war should have ended. There are lots of interesting and difficult questions that we can all grapple with, and that perhaps we should have grappled with at the time. But I'm really focused on. There's a lot of folks who are relying on me, my team, and other folks here at this witness stand who, those are important conversations that we can have. But these folks who are facing life and death in dire circumstances are really relying on us to take actions moving forward. And so that's where I'm spending the majority of my time and effort and research. And what I'm much more familiar with is how to get more SIVs here, how to protect maybe the women and girls who weren't protected by that 2020 agreement. But that's what I'm focused on in the stories that I hope to tell here today.
Thank you for that. And I have to agree that one of the most wrenching tragedies of the Taliban's takeover has been the devastating impact on the women and girls of Afghanistan. Women who had high-ranking positions, who had good, productive jobs, who are no longer able to work. Girls who were attending school, who loved learning, who were preparing for the future, who are no longer able to get any education. And several years ago, before the withdrawal, we had a Zoom meeting with a group of these women, and we asked them if they were trying to get out. And surprisingly, they said no, that they wanted to stay and fight for the soul of their country. So, Ms. Mackler, I want to ask you, what is being done to help women and girls in Afghanistan, and what more can be done?
I don't know. I'm an immigration lawyer. As I said, they have no options. I think there's only pressure that can be put on the Taliban to uphold international standards of human rights and to treat them in a certain way. Just today, the New York Times had an article on how these women and girls are suffering even more right now under the cruel winter that Afghanistan is going through. I think we have to continue to shine a light on the conditions that they are under and continue to exert pressure. I will say I have met some truly extraordinary women. I was very privileged in the early days of the evacuation to help one young woman, barely 23 years old, who escaped hours before the fall of Kabul and had been running a nonprofit in Afghanistan to educate women, and she continues to do that from the United States. And she's not the only one who I know has come here and continues these efforts within other networks of women to continue the work that was happening, even if it's less visible now by necessity. I also, many of them, including one of my own colleagues who was the commander of a female tactical platoon who worked with our cultural sensitivity teams in the U.S. military, and who works with me now working on Afghans who've been resettled in upstate New York. She and others like her have continued to tell me that their biggest wish, their biggest desire is to return, to be able to find a way one day to return so that they can keep fighting that fight.
I want to thank all of you for all the work you're doing. I wish we could hear more. My time